So Ruth has already introduced herself, but let me give her an added introduction. Ruth's background is a PhD in cell biology, so she's has the scientific qualifications and has been working with the Faraday almost since its inception 12 years ago. Some of the things that she's probably well known for are the Test of Faith material, which is there on the bookstore, and then the book God in the Lab, subsequent to that. She's going to be talking to us on the excitement of being a scientist and a Christian, and why every Christian really should hope to be a scientist.
Great. Yeah, so my aim is at the end to make you feel slightly disappointed that you didn't take science, if you didn't, or nostalgic if you did, and have since moved on to something else, and think, oh well, I didn't, but at least I can now integrate science, and even in quite a small way. Maybe a medium to large-sized way, if we manage to do our job very well, into the life of the church. And my aim is not to give a very deep academic lecture. There is if you want to go into a lot more depth, there are Faraday papers and books. My aim is to give a very quick overview of some areas that I think are important when it comes to science and faith in the local church, and some ideas of things that you can mention in your own church. So, my work at the moment came from one of the inspirations among many was a video that we actually filmed ourselves. One of the video clips that is on the Test of Faith website was Alistair McGrath speaking about science and faith, saying, I think a real problem here is that Christians who are scientists are always reacting. And one of the big questions is, how do we begin to take charge of the cultural agenda? He went on to say we need scientists to go into the top of their field, and we need them to show how faith enriches their science. And I thought, yeah, that's right. The debates and the discussions and the difficult questions are important, but they're not the whole thing. Setting the cultural agenda and thinking, I'm a Christian, I'm a scientist, or I'm a Christian who's enthusiastic about science, so what? Now what? How do I start the conversation if someone from the BBC phoned me up and didn't say, we need someone to go head-to-head with whoever it is, but said, what do you want to say? What would I say? So helping the church engage with contemporary scientific culture in a positive way is something that I've been trying to do for the last about 5 or 6 years. And I just came up with a list of as many contexts as possible I could think of. Obviously, you're here because you think it is relevant. But there are all sorts of ways we can slip science in to the life of the church, whether it's sermons, obviously, sung worship, prayers and liturgies, as we just did. That was an excerpt from the Test of Faith church service material. Whether it's evening talks and film showings, maybe events that are thrown open to friends and family, whether it's family events or adult small groups, home groups, Lent groups, whatever you call them in where you are, youth groups, young adults or students, schools. There are plenty of church schools around. There are plenty of teachers in churches who have schools that we could step into. Children's groups, men's breakfast, the occasional women's breakfast, visuals. We have an art gallery corner in my church where I did an exhibition of scientific images. Theatre. There is a Riding Lights production on science that's touring the country this year. Walks. We've had some people do a pilgrimage, science and faith pilgrimage. And of course, practical action when it comes to things like climate change and the environment. And I think science should be on the agenda for all of these things, just as one of the points. It doesn't have to dominate, but it should be something that we cycle through in the usual course of events in the church, because we live in a science-saturated society and we need to serve our congregations on that point. So today I'm going to speak in the next 45 minutes, so we leave half an hour for discussion and questions. I'm going to give you a very quick skim of a little bit of history and philosophy of science, a little bit of theology of science, or I've called it from faith to science, a little bit of theology of nature, I've called it from science to faith, a little bit about Christ, because often these conversations about science and faith are very sort of generic God, so I want to bring Jesus into it. A little bit then a good chunk on scientists of faith. I think these are some of the most important stories to be telling, both scientists from the past, famous ones, and also the ones who are around at the moment. And then I'm going to give you a case study of one scientist who's a person of faith from some material I've been developing so far. So let's have a little look at the history and philosophy of science. I wouldn't use this title in a church context, but I have for you, because I think you can handle it. But basically, I think this is where a lot of it starts, laying the foundations for a helpful conversation. I think a lot of the misconceptions come from a misunderstanding of what science is. So I'm going to put out what I think science is. I can discuss later. Keith can frown at me if he thinks I've got it wrong, or if he's got a different opinion. But I think this is often the place to start, I think. I find that people who challenge me on the fact that science and faith can fit together are often not actually scientists. They've misunderstood what science is. Science is not about proving yourself right. It's often about proving other people wrong, or yourself wrong. But it's usually a gradual search for evidence. I say usually because scientific research can be very unpredictable. It often is about taking things apart. Not always. Reductionism, to come up with general principles that you could express as probabilities. So all scientific research is provisional. You can't ever come to a complete conclusion. Or maybe testing ideas, the old hypotheses that you probably came up with in school science. Hopefully getting nearer to the truth all the time. So proving yourself wrong, proving other people wrong, learning new things, getting nearer to the truth. You might go down some tangents. You might get further away from the truth for a while, but the aim is that overall that the scientific community getting nearer the truth. It's collaborative. We are accountable to each other. We have to be. It's difficult stuff. It's easy to fool yourself. It's creative. It's imaginative. It's intuitive. By this, I don't mean making stuff up. I mean it's about problem solving. It's about taking your knowledge that is in its mental pigeonholes and giving it a shake and trying to make connections between things. Now I have a new idea, have an original idea, let's test it. Or by intuitive, I mean you wake up in the morning or in the bath, you're all relaxed and you have an idea and it's come from nowhere, but it's actually, when you think about it, you think, oh yeah, no, why do I think I should do that experiment? Once you start to unpick that thought apart, you realize that it's actually based on quite a lot of experience. It's a hunch, but it's based on experience, and then you might want to test it in the lab. So you could summarize, and I should say you don't have to scribble frantically during this time. I've put my slides on the Moodle platform already, so you can, sorry, I should have said that at the beginning. So you can relax. Science is the study of things that can be weighed, measured, observed in different ways. It's not about questions of meaning or value. It might raise plenty of questions of meaning and value, can't answer them. It's about generalizations or mathematical descriptions of things. You're always trying to come up with a nice, neat way to sum things up. The neater, the better. It's always provisional. It's always open to falsification. You have to be humble in science. And realize that your student might come up with a better idea than you, drat them, and realize that and pull the rug out from it. Maybe you're hoping that they do. The bright young things will come along and come up with better ideas. It's about reducing personal bias as much as possible. We all have our worldviews. We all have our reasons why we think things are pretty or satisfying. But that's why we work together, because together we can come up with sort of cut away the chaff and get to the heart of things. There we go. So that's science. And you find the things that match the size of the net you throw out into the sea. So if you go at the world with a science-shaped net, you will find scientific answers to things. You can't go into the world with a large mesh net and say, well, there's no little fish in the sea, are there? It's ridiculous. Science can only answer certain kinds of questions. Or another very simple way and much used way of describing this, the relationship between science and faith, is thinking about mechanism and meaning. You look at the boiling kettle, you could write a very nice physics essay, some of us here, I hope, about the movement of atoms and molecules, and that would be a scientific description of the boiling kettle. But we are human beings, and we like to think that we have make our own choices, and the meaning of the boiling kettle might be something completely different. I've just met an old friend, let's have a cup of tea. Or I've just arrived at a course, let's have a cup of tea and get to know each other, relax, and begin the course. So that's one way of looking at it. So the people who say science and faith are at odds are actually making a category error. Another way to look at it in a more nuanced way would be to look at layers. So it's an artist might make a print by building up several different layers of paint. And to see the whole picture, you need to look at all the layers. Similarly, in life, there are different ways of looking at reality. Theology, philosophy, science, history, art, and to understand the whole of reality as best you can. Okay, none of us are complete polymaths, but you need to be able to look at as many layers as possible and see the whole picture. So where did science come from? I suspect, as Eleanor, she was meaning to be facetious, but I think she was partly right. In a sense, we are all scientists. We do explore the world ever since we were one and put something in our mouth, or less than one, to find out what it was like. But the actual records of people doing science in a more formal way start with people like the ancient Greeks. Some of the Greek philosophers were into doing experiments. Persia, India, Egypt, people were looking at the stars, they were looking at the world around them, making observations, building on them. The Arab world mopped up a lot of this knowledge and made great advances in mathematics, in astronomy, in medicine. And then, for reasons we'll pass over quickly, those texts made their way into Europe and were translated into Latin, and people started doing science here in fits and starts, but now here we are in the Western world doing science. And Christian theology did make its contribution. Here's a Israeli, oh, sorry, you've lost the bottom of my slides, never mind, you have to get them on Moodle. Scholar saying that one cannot recount the history of modern science without acknowledging the crucial importance of Christianity. So Christian theology did feed into how science works today. Obviously, you now do not have to be a Christian to be a scientist, but it's interesting to look at that. So we'll go from faith to science. And another couple of Bible passages. The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. There's Psalm 19. Or we go back to Genesis. God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and increase in number. Fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky and over every creature that moves on the ground. So, and there are many more Bible passages one could look at when thinking about the earth and how it works and how God sustains it. But just 4 ideas of how theology has informed science. Those first scientists who were Christians or came from a Christian background at the very least and were able to say this is a good thing for us to be doing. They had to, like scientists now, they had to defend what they were doing and raise money. So first of all, creation is God's. It is good. There's nothing to be afraid of here in terms of, if I find something out, it will hurt my faith. It is a good thing to study. And it's a very worthy subject to study. Creation is not God. So we don't need to be afraid of touching, tasting, poking, looking. It's not an act of sacrilege in a sense. So long as we do it responsibly, we can explore. God is separate from creation. But creation is contingent on God. It relied on him. God is the creator and sustainer of the whole earth, of the whole universe. So we can't predict from mathematical principles what it should have been like, because nothing was constraining God. God wasn't constrained by anything. He made it as he wanted to. So to find out about it, we have to go out and look. That sounds ridiculously obvious now, but that was actually a very key thought in the origin of science. Guys, we can't just imagine how things are or do some philosophy sitting in an armchair. We have to do experiments and get our hands dirty. And also the idea of scientific law. The Bible speaks of rhythms, of times, of seasons, of a God who is not capricious, who's faithful and merciful to us. So the early scientists went out thinking, well, if the world has been made in a good, ordered way, we should be able to understand the mechanisms that make it work and the principles upon which it is based. And they went out and looked, and lo and behold, they did find law-like behavior, and they came up with all the laws of physics, gravity and the speed of light and so on. And now we just assume that the world is a reliable place to study. On the whole, give or take a few surprises with quantum mechanics, that we can understand it. It's understandable. But that was actually a bit of a step of faith, bit of the ancient grant proposal. We think this is going to be the way the world is. So you could come up, in a sense, with a theology of science, saying that if all creation is God's domain, creation is very good, humans are rational, we're made in the image of God, humankind were created to serve and preserve creation, is one way of translating those early passages of Genesis. You end up with science being a form of worship in its very broadest sense. Or as Michael Faraday said, the book of nature, which we have to read, is written by the finger of God. What an exciting book to read. Are you jealous yet? So this is my model for the relationship between science and faith. If my life is one big Venn diagram, gosh, I hope it isn't. That makes me sound a bit boring. But my faith is the big circle. It affects everything, all my behavior, my mindset. Within science, there is the subset of science. I have the same behavior. I don't become a different person suddenly. But when I was working in science, various of my personality traits would become more important. The ability to observe, maybe to be a bit of a perfectionist in some areas. And there would be some things I would do in science I wouldn't do in the rest of life. I would get very excited about a very rare form of cancer, but not when I'm visiting Auntie Joan in hospital. You can't, there are behaviors that are appropriate to different circumstances. Likewise, I would pray that I would do a very good job in my experiment, the same as I would pray I'd do a good job in any area of life, but I wouldn't pray for a particular outcome. That would be completely ridiculous. Who am I to tell God how he should have made the universe? So that's how I see it working together. I should say this isn't to scale. It's kind of fun to have a go making it and seeing the overlaps. But anyway, that's an exercise for a leadership course probably, or something on burnout rather than science and faith. So how do we go from science to faith? Does it feed in the other way? Absolutely. And we can come up with a theology of nature. This is very influenced by my reading of theologian Alistair McGrath. Sometimes people call it natural theology, but it's the idea that theology is a lens through which we look at the rest of the world. Does it make sense of the world? Does it bring things into focus? Is science consistent with the belief in a loving, purposeful creator? So often people come to these conversations wanting proof for God, but I'm afraid this is all I can offer, responsibly, I think. So if we do this, looking at the world through the lens of theology, I believe it makes sense of the world. It makes sense of the order that we see, the physical laws, the regular patterns and processes, because God is sustaining the earth. It makes sense of the fact that the universe appears to have had a beginning. I don't need scientific evidence to convince me that God created the universe, but there seems to be a resonance there. The fruitfulness of the earth, the great diversity from our great provider, the increasing complexity, things are going in a direction. There seems to be some kind of plan. It's compatible with there being some kind of plan. The fact that things are so interdependent, we are interdependent. No one can live on there, hermits try to live completely independently, but I suspect many of them receive some food from various people. We are not completely independent. And that seems to be part of the way God has made the world. There is freedom, random processes from which patterned and planned order comes from. God is God is a merciful Father. You read the prodigal son and see that God let his son learn by himself. So I believe that God has given creation the ability, in a sense, to create itself. And then there's great beauty as well. And that beauty, the awe one might feel occasionally in a lab, the wonder that is probably one of the things that gets a working scientist out of bed every day, as well as many other motivations, can lead into a sense of worship. They can make us ask deeper questions. What is this for? What is it about? Or if one is already a Christian, it can feed into that sense that there is a purpose in the world, and there are more important things than, whether this particular experiment or that one works out or not. There are bigger things going on here. And this can feed into a wider conversation about science and faith. So it doesn't, again, yes, the debates and the difficult questions are very important, but they're not everything. These are the kinds of things that we can talk about when we say, I'm a scientist and a Christian, so what? And sometimes people do a stronger natural theology, that's fine. But, trying to learn more about God from creation. But we need to be aware of the pitfalls. We're not going to find proof of God. Will we find evidence for God? I'm not sure. Some people think so, some people don't. I'm more happier with the kind of resonance idea of it making sense. Maybe because I'm a biologist. There's been a history of bad practice in this area for biologists. You can't learn that much about God. You can learn some very general things. You're never going to find Jesus in creation, although it was created through him. It risks, in a sense, elevating creation above the creator. If you get too carried away, you could end up worshipping creation. Something to avoid. And, we're human. We can make mistakes. We can read too much in. So, like scientists, we need accountability. We need to collaborate and make sure we don't start saying crazy things or things that aren't compatible with biblical Christianity. And also creation is groaning. When we look at through the lens of theology, we know that there's something wrong. And certainly we have caused a lot of problems in creation. So this is an imperfect world, if you like, that we are seeing God's reflection in. So it's a slightly tarnished reflection. So, for all those reasons, I'm very careful when I do natural theology. I think there's a lot one can do in a sort of knee-jerk way that isn't very helpful. So going on to think about Christ, as I said, often these discussions about science and faith can revolve around a sort of generic idea of God. And I've been involved in a project that has produced 2 books by Zondervan Academic, which I think will be out later on this year, about Christ and the cosmos, trying to bring or gather together the people who are talking about Jesus in this context, which should be very helpful for you, I hope. Jesus had power over creation. He got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, "Quiet, be still." Then the wind died down and it was completely calm, reflecting the fact that here is someone who's given up, this is God, he's given up a lot of his power to come down to earth, but that connection is there. He's given up a lot of his, anyway, I won't try and give you a lesson on theology. You look at the incarnation, this is the Word, this is the Creator, through whom everything was made, as John said. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Jesus was there right at the beginning. Through him, all things were made. But then he became a living organism. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. He became part of this world. He gave dignity to living things by becoming one. The maker of DNA took on DNA himself and developed just like any other child did. This is Jesus' relationship to creation. And also there is the idea that God's kingdom includes all of creation. I'm sure this is something that Hilary is going to draw on in her talk. For God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in Christ, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. And Romans 8 is along a similar theme, It goes straight to all of creation will be redeemed. So this isn't just about us. This is about the whole planet. So when we think about science and faith, this is something, all these things we study are things that God is very interested in, understatement, is very interested in. So therefore, as a Christian who's a scientist, one can have a greater sense of wonder and worship, or at least a very different sense of wonder and worship. There's even more reason to do science. This is God's world. This is Christ's creation. Science is a very serious responsibility. We should be asking the most difficult questions we can. We should be holding ourselves to even greater account. We should be trying to do the best science we can. We need to be open to the philosophical or theological implications of what we do. We can't just naively do the science and think, well, I hope somebody does something good with this knowledge. I mean, some people will be called to take quite a big part in figuring out, in trying to help legislation and other things, general practice to be good, to use technology, to develop technology that is good around the things that are discovered. Some people find a real driver to be practical. They want to serve people. They want to help. They want to serve and preserve creation. And people like myself might look at what science has learned and use this as a way of telling new parables. I don't tend to use really technical science. It gets a bit ridiculous if you try and find God in the interaction between components of a ribosome or something like that. But there is we can start telling parables about things that people generally know about. We know that creation will be redeemed. There is hope. People who are working in ecology really need that. And also, because creation is being redeemed, we have a responsibility to take part in that. And I won't steal any more of Hillary's thunder. I'll leave her to talk about that later. So moving on to scientists of faith. And these are the stories I love telling, and I always try and have, because I've been out of the lab since 2006, and I always try and stay in touch with working scientists. There are a number at Faraday, and I also, at the moment, I'm working with 6 biologists or 6 people who work on biological topics, and have those stories to tell, make sure I'm not just looking at the world, looking at science through rose-tinted glasses and forgetting all the difficult parts or all the contradictions. So I'll start with the story of the Cavendish lab. This was the first physics lab in Cambridge with this Latin on the door. If you're a Latin scholar and that picture was good, you will be able to see that it is the verse from Psalm 111. And it's now on the new physics lab as well. The works of the Lord are great, sought out of all them that have pleasure therein. So James Clerk Maxwell, or someone on his team, put that verse in Latin on the first physics lab. And then a Christian physics student, who's now a physics professor, when the new Cavendish lab was being built, said, are we going to have that verse on the door? And are you going to do it in English? And to everyone's surprise, they did. It was covered over by a canopy for quite a while, but now it's just been revealed. Again, the canopy's been taken away so you can see it. I don't know what people think about it. I don't know if they notice it on the way in. But this is a great thing for a scientist to be able to think, yes, I'm doing something looking at the works of God in creation. Here are 3 scientists through the ages. Johannes Kepler, an astronomer, he really wants to be a theologian. There's some quotes I found where he said, I was very disappointed I didn't get a job in theology, but now I've been offered the chair in astronomy instead, or whatever it was called at the time. And he eventually came to terms with it and realized that here was a way he could worship God by studying his creation. And his books and papers are littered with prayers. We're not allowed to do that anymore in science. It wouldn't be appropriate because not all scientists are Christians. But he certainly did that and saw that as very important. Similarly, Isaac Newton, just down the road in Trinity College, one of the people who are credited with inventing calculus, he actually saw his theological work as being more important than his scientific work, and he wrote more words in theology than his science. It's his science that is the lasting legacy, and probably that's good. His theology was slightly strange, in my humble opinion. It's also written in code, but he was someone who's a very devout Christian. And Robert Boyle, chemist, later on, who was an aristocrat who spent his, well, I could cynically say all his time was his spare time. He didn't have to work, but he did lots of science, and saw that as part of his service to God. He did great work in chemistry, and Boyle's law and all these kinds of things that we learned in school chemistry. So, and then we have Galileo, much quoted, great writer. The greatness and the glory of God shine forth marvelously in all his works, and is to be read above all in the open book of the heavens. And people like to tell us about the controversy over Galileo, and there are some urban legends that have built up. The truth of what happened to him is that he was cheeky to the Pope, and was, kind of, oi, come here. And he had been given some freedom to talk about his ideas. The Catholic Church was going through difficult times and had become a little bit paranoid about what scientists were doing. They've since apologized for that, but he was upbraided for what he did and put under house arrest for the rest of his life. He was able to carry on his science. I don't think he was able to publish. He was able to do his work. He hadn't come up with definitive evidence that the sun goes around, the earth goes around the sun. Sorry. But he was, he did a lot of great stuff, including finding that the moon was not a perfect sphere. He built the first telescope and saw these wonderful craters that are all over the moon. So he did some really good scientific work, and was a very devout Christian and saw this as part of his service. I have a nice quote from Kepler as well, and we've used this as a prayer in Christians and science meetings. If I have been enticed into rashness by the wonderful beauty of thy works, or if I have loved my own glory among men, while advancing in work destined for thy glory, gently and mercifully pardon me, and finally deign graciously to cause that these demonstrations may lead to thy glory and to the salvation of souls, and nowhere be an obstacle to that. Isn't that great? So Kepler is sometimes said, he's caught up in the controversy of does the sun go around the earth or not? He did have to be persuaded to publish his work, but it was by someone who was a person of faith. I think it was a priest who encouraged him to publish. Or was that Copernicus? I better stop before I get my history of science wrong. But the stories of the early scientists are littered with stories about their faith and how their faith and their science interacted, and it's great. I do recommend Ron Number's book about the myths of science. I don't know if it's on the bookstall, and there are a number of historical books on the bookstall. Digging into these stories is very, very worthwhile. Scientists are Christians. I only have data for the US at the moment. The UK data is coming very soon. 61% in the US of scientists, natural and social medical scientists, said that they identify as a person of faith, and about 74% of the general population in the US. So it's not the same figure. It's not 74% in the science who are people of faith. It's a bit less. There is a bit of a cultural war going on there, or poor recruitment for careers, or whatever there is, but it's certainly not a low number. So when people look at me with a sort of, oh, poor you, it must have been really hard for you being a Christian in sciences, and I think, well, one or two controversies or one or two conversations I had to have, but on the whole, I was fine. It's really my friends in English literature or theology who are really struggling, being put through the mill. And those struggles help them to grow in their faith, that's great. This idea that, science has hardly got any people of faith in it. It will vary from institute to institute, from subject to subject, random variations in population, but on the whole, I've never been alone as a Christian in science. And then you have someone like Francis Collins, who ran the Human Genome Project, saying it's possible for the scientist believer to be intellectually fulfilled and spiritually alive, both worshipping God and using the tools of science to uncover some of the awesome mysteries of his creation. And I like quoting from him because there he is. He's one of the most influential scientists in the US. He runs the NIH, which is the same as the MRC here, or similar to the MRC here, and which are presidential appointments, big job, and he's quite open about his faith. Then you have people like Catherine Blundell, the astronomer in Oxford University. She's been given an OBE for her work in the community, but she is again, very happy to be a scientist and a Christian. And then someone like Sir John Houghton, who used to run the Met Office research end of things and also was very involved, one of the co-chair of the scientific panel of the IPCC, which was putting together the evidence for is human-caused climate change actually happening, and won the Japan Prize for his work, equivalent to the Nobel Prize for his area of science. He's again quite upfront about how he's a Christian. And I think it's really important to get these voices out there. I think I found it, certainly as a student, when I heard about these kinds of guys, I found it very helpful. And also, just asking them, which I have done over the last few years. So how would you open the conversation if you got a chance to start the conversation about science and faith? And you sort of see them give a big grin and think, I can't believe you just said that. Nobody ever asks me that. And they plunge into some story of wonder or awe, or maybe how their faith has gotten through a sticky patch in their research career, or influenced the way they manage people, or all sorts of things. That's great to hear. Here's another one, Jennifer Wiseman, who runs the research end of the Hubble Space Telescope. We now know that there are hundreds of billions of galaxies, and that's just made God ever so much more great. Not threatened at all by advances in science, but very excited. Ask them about, is there life on other planets? Oh yeah, wouldn't that be great? And not just because they're wide-eyed with wonder and naive, but they have thought about these things, and said, no, actually, if God created the whole universe, who am I to say he doesn't need to create life on other planets? Maybe he wanted to. So my own view is that faith makes sense of science. Obviously, there are still difficult issues to think through. There are still questions. But overall, I'm convinced, I've seen enough to convince me that faith makes sense of science. And I'm very keen on building bridges between the scientific and faith worlds and starting new dialogues, as well as talking about the big questions. We need to do that, and we'll do that over the next couple of days. When people ask me about reasons for faith, often if I give this kind of talk, they say, well, you haven't made a case for God at all. And I'm like, well, it wasn't quite what I intended to do. I wanted to remove barriers for faith. I wanted to show you why it's good to be a scientist and a Christian. But the reason I'm a Christian is because of what Jesus did, what I read in the Bible, what I see his followers doing today, what they've done in the past. Science feeds into that, my sense of wonder at what there is out in the world. Gosh, it's incredible, and faith makes sense of that. So I think the focus on proof for God, hard proof for God, and having to have hard proof for God in this kind of discussion, I think isn't very helpful. So let me give you a case study just to finish in the last 5 or 6 minutes. Wonders of the Living World. This is the project that I'm working on at the moment. I'm working with these 6 scientists from the US and the UK. There's a physicist in there, there's a paleontologist in there, marine biologist, all sorts of different subjects. And today I'm going to tell you one of their stories. I'm going to tell you Jeff's story and show you a rough cut of one of the videos we've made on his work. So this is called Humble Beginnings. And this is the kind of story I like to tell in a church context. So this is a familiar story, sperm meets egg. And there you are. There's the beginning of a potential new person, with the 2 nuclei, mother's and father's nuclei, about to meet inside the egg cell and mingle their DNA together and create a new person. And that's a familiar story. We know the outcome. If everything goes well, out comes a baby. But Jeff doesn't study babies, he studies worms. These are about that big, 1 to 2 millimeters long. You need not a terribly powerful microscope to see them, but you do need a microscope to look at them. They're good because they're cheap, they don't take up much room, and they share a lot of the same processes, basic processes of development as our bodies. They have a gut, they have a nervous system, and they reproduce. They don't need a partner to reproduce with, but never mind, they do, in the end, they all have the similar bits and pieces, and we can do experiments on them. We can light up different areas of them, as you can see in this picture of a worm, in quite an attractive but also very useful way. So, as Jeff says, you can learn a lot about a Ferrari by looking at a Ford Fiesta. That's kind of the idea. So he's based in the University of Wisconsin in Madison, and I particularly wanted to introduce you to him today because he almost became a minister. So he took a interesting route through university. He's one of those people who never knew what he wanted to do. Make me feel better because I never did either. Went into university to study music and physics. Decided he'd reached his limit with the maths, so he went into medicine. But then he got hooked on embryology, so he went into biology. But then he wondered if he wanted to become a full-time pastor, so he went to divinity school for a few years, got his divinity degree, and then thought, you know what? I think I'm called to actually be in science. So he went back in, did a PhD in biophysics, looking at embryos, and he stayed in the university ever since. But he does teach in the I think it's the religion department there, and there's a course on science and faith they've done in the past. So he's one of the scientists I can go to who has quite a deep understanding of the theology, is able to explain himself well. So I don't have videos. I said the video I'm about to show you is a rough cutting. It contains no pictures or animations, so I have to show you the pictures first. Sorry, it's not very slick. But anyway, here are the kind of embryos that he got hooked on. This is a sea urchin embryo. Whatever floats your boat. I think they're pretty. No, it's up to you. You can see it dividing 4 cells, 8, 16, going through its divisions. This probably happened over a period of just, part of a day. The fish I used to work on would start, the eggs would be fertilized in the morning, and then, by the evening, you're almost seeing not quite a complete fish, but you can see its body forming. It happened very fast. It's very exciting to watch. So you got completely hooked on this, and then moved to the worms as a model organism, we call them. You can see the worm developing. Someone's done this time-lapse photo. This was actually entered in an art competition. They have an art competition for these worms every year, believe it or not. Biologists are really visually oriented. They always have to have nice pictures in there, often visually oriented, have to have nice pictures in their presentations. So you can see, again, different ways of visualizing different kinds of cells. So these are, I don't know if they're fluorescent proteins or if they're antibodies that have been tagged with fluorescence, but they've used them to, I think they're looking at the gut here. It runs all the way through the worm. And there's some more posing for you. They have 959 cells. They're so simple. Someone was able to map out how the cells divide starting from 1 and come up with almost a family tree of the cells. I'd show you the map, but it's so complicated it's kind of pointless showing it to you. But I think it's wonderful and very beautiful. It's incredibly useful. Couldn't do it for a human. We're too complex and there's too much variability. But in an organism this simple, there's not much variability. Makes it incredibly useful. I'm told the guy who did this work wore a rut in his lab floor with his wheeled chair from his microscope to his lab book and back again. That's serious patience. I actually, when I was giving a talk like this, I thought he was sitting at the back of the room. I thought, heck, that's Fred Sanger at the back. He looks really like him. He wasn't in the end, but I felt I had to behave myself. What I said in C. elegans was a bit disturbing. Anyway, and this is the kind of thing that Jeff studies. So you can see this is a cell, and this is a worm embryo before it starts looking like a worm, these kinds of things. And he's looking at the joins between cells. As an embryo develops, people talk about life unfolding. It doesn't unfold. That metaphor winds me up. Life folds up. As the cells divide, They start, it's like a ceilidh, you know, they all hold hands, run over here, and then they let go, and then two lines mingle, merge, and go one past each other, you know, and then some go over here, some go over there. And then you have sheets of cells, and the leading edge of the sheet will run along. Seeing the cells, it's almost as if they've got feet. Not quite. This is a very slow process. But anyway, the metaphor works. And they'll drag the sheet with them, you know. And then they'll, you know, some of them in the middle will duck through and create an arch, you know. And that's how the embryo folds up and folds up. But the connections between cells are very important. It's a bit like Velcro. How do they stick together? How do they let go? If you can't stick together, you can't let go in your cells, you're dead, basically. So it's very important. So I'm going to leave you with a video of Jeff. I'll let him explain himself. I asked him what questions of meaning and purpose does your work raise, and this is what he came up with.
I study embryonic development, and it really causes me to think pretty deeply about where did I come from? Where does each of us come from? What are the processes that underlie how each of us arose as an embryo? And those are pretty profound questions when you stop to think about it. And we really have humble beginnings. We start as a cell that is 1/10 of a millimeter in diameter. You can barely see it with the naked eye. In fact, if you don't look carefully, you'll miss it. That's how we all began. And so the fragility of each of our lives is something to think about, I think. You know, wow, that's an amazing process that leads to who we are. And yet those processes of development are incredibly reproducible. I mean, most of us turn out pretty much the same way with the same structures. And so those processes themselves are amazing, but it does cause me to think about who I am and the fact that the processes that gave rise to me are something pretty special and something that causes me to think about myself pretty humbly, frankly. I think one of the other things that for me, I happen to be a Christian, and one of the key ideas in historic Christianity is the idea that that Jesus of Nazareth is actually God in the flesh. And for that to be true, he's human. And so he went through the very same steps that all of us went through. And that fills me with a sense of complete amazement and helps me to see that just how thoroughly and completely God identifies with us as human beings.
So there you are. My lifelong research interest, he said, is understanding how embryos develop, and that for me has always been pursued from a profoundly Christian perspective. So, and there's his worm embryos a la Andy Warhol, he called that picture. So he's just used different UV filters, different filters on his microscope, the same as you might use filters on a normal camera to get different colors. So first of all, I'm going to ask, are there any questions? And then after that, I've got a few questions that we can discuss together among yourselves. So any clarifications, anything you didn't understand, don't be shy. Probably everyone else couldn't understand it either if you couldn't. Yes?
Last year, there was a publication in The Cell in which some scientists had been doing something with a prosthetic hand, and they made this remark in their paper about this was then going to be able to work as the creator intended. And there was a huge, great big furore about it,
Wow.
which led to the paper actually being withdrawn because they'd used the word creator. And that was an example of the very negative view that there is about faith, sometimes from the scientific perspective. And I just wondered whether or not you could say something about, how hard or easy it is for the faith conversations to happen within the scientific context. I mean, there are questions about whether or not that paper should have been published in the first place, but it was a peer-reviewed publication, so it had slipped through and it was there. And as you said, in the past, many scientists were able to talk about their faith in a very public way, but it seems as though now there is a climate in which you can't.
Yeah.
Can you comment on that?
Yeah, well, I suspect this is a case of the American separation of church and state, primarily. I'm going to assume, because of the fury, that it was an American journal, American Lab.
It was an online journal.
Yeah.
And there were people from this country, scientists from this
Right.
country, that were
Yeah.
contributing, saying that they weren't going to allow their students to ever read publications.
Okay. Okay.
If this was
Right.
allowed to go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, so, I mean, certainly in the US, this is often a problem, the separation of church and state, and science is used as a sort of political tool in that way. I mean, yeah, there will always be people who get annoyed. I'm not an editor of a journal, though Keith is, so you can comment on it in a minute. And I think, yeah, it was, I mean, as I said, it depends where you are, what department you're in, who's around. I mainly encountered either polite interest or indifference, or I think some people probably thought I was a bit crazy, but were too polite to say. I think on the whole, I mean, other scientists can comment. I mean, you might end up with some poisonous environments, and certainly in a very public discussion like that, there will be a few loud voices, but I think they're a real minority. The unfortunate thing is, I mean, in any kind of debate like this, often the minority are so noisy, they sound like a majority. I don't know if Keith wants to comment on that as a journal editor, and do you want to, oh, he's and a working scientist.
Yes, I mean, I'm familiar with the paper you're talking about. I'm not sure it was Cell, but whichever journal it was. I think there was overreaction on both sides. Science is supposed to be about presenting the facts and the interpretation of that without necessarily imposing meaning on that. And that paper did start to push the boundaries of what would normally be acceptable. But I thought the reaction against that also was over the top. It was, I think, I did read the paper, and I think it was only 2 or 3 instances within that were very gently put. And as Ruth has said, there are that vocal minority who overreact at the slightest provocation, and that was one example. Certainly in the journal that I edit, is that anything that does go beyond the science itself and starts to talk about purpose and meaning, we don't allow that from either perspective. So in the same way as you wouldn't allow a Christian to use their scientific discovery in a scientific paper to advocate Christian faith. Similarly, it wouldn't be allowable for somebody of a non-believer to say, well, actually, this shows that there can't be a God. That those sorts of philosophical, purposeful, meaningful statements in a scientific paper are just beyond the boundaries of what science is there to do. We could talk about this later, but thank you for raising that.
Yeah. So, any more questions of clarification? Yep.
In my limited understanding of faith and science down through the centuries, I always got the impression that science came about, certainly in the Western world, because of their faith in God, as you kind of alluded to in your presentation. When do you think there was this divide started where people felt that really you can't have the two together? Because to my mind, it makes sense to have them both together, because it just seems natural. But there appears to be a time when the faith seemed to be separated from the science. And is that a relatively recent thing, would you suggest, or has it been something that's been ongoing over the years?
Well, for a precise answer, you need to ask a historian of science, but you might get several people and several different opinions about when it is hugely complex, politically, culturally, theologically. I mean, the way universities are structured now, you have the different departments, and the students are all, I'm a theology student, I'm a science student, and that divide didn't exist back then in the beginning. And science wasn't called science, it was called natural philosophy, and then people valued the philosophy over the getting your hands dirty, learning about the world, which they would have thought was dusty mechanics, you know. You know, someone from here, William Whewell, I think, who coined the term scientist for the people who did the sort of messing around with their hands. trying to separate it from the philosophy side of the subject. So I suspect the professional divide, I am a scientist, Hilary wants to say something, came about very gradually. The conflict model, there are a couple of books that were really influential. That one came out written by someone at Cornell University, called one of the books was called The History of the Warfare of Science and Religion, I think it was called, and they invented quite a lot of history. It's full of references that should be there that aren't there, you know. So a lot of the urban legends about the conflict myth go back to those books. And I think, you know, for whatever reason, one could guess at reasons, they wanted a divide between the church and professional science. They had their own drums to bang. But Hilary's, I know, has spoken on this area, so she may want to add something. But we probably can't come up with a precise date. It's probably more of a rift, a perceived rift, I'd say, that's happened. But there's always been tons of Christians who've been doing science. So in reality, then there's a noisy minority, but the majority are just getting on with their lives, you know. So.
Yes, if I could just add that I'm not a historian of science, but I've done a little bit of thinking about it, and particularly reading the work of John Hedley Brooke, who is a historian of science, and he would talk in terms about a kind of a separation and a coming back together of science and Christian faith as part of the sort of cultural world of the Enlightenment and modernity and so on. So he sees that the relationship changed, and then to pick up on the idea that they are in conflict, that was, as Ruth says, propagated by the publication of these two books. But let me just give you a little illustration so you can see how so often some of this has a very social reason. There, you may have heard of a famous debate between Thomas Huxley and the Bishop of Oxford on the evolution question, and supposedly the Bishop of Oxford had to retreat bleeding, but actually there is no record of that debate except sort of second-hand subsequent. And one of the reasons that Thomas Huxley was such a passionate atheist and became such a passionate atheist was because he was not of particularly good connections, if you like, and he saw that in that day, in the 19th century, science was often done by clergymen, basically. So people that were clergy or had aristocratic connections didn't need to earn money, and so they did the science. And he was not in that way. He couldn't get a job. He didn't have any connections. He had nobody that would sort of open doors for him to have employment. And he basically was very anti-establishment, and the church represented the establishment. And so some of his kind of vociferous opposition to the church and the Bible and so on comes out of that milieu of himself being disappointed. So that's just one area of complexity, and there are many, many others, but just by illustration.
Yeah, and when you get onto creationism debates in the US, it gets even more complex and even more political and cultural, and not, in a sense, not at all theological. Now we have just a couple minutes. I do want to get you discussing rather more questions. We're going to the gentleman with the stripy jersey, and I think we'll make that the last one, and then we'll go to discussion. But I'm here for the next 2 days, so do ask me questions.
Embryology and the local church. In my experience as a minister, we've had many IVF babies come for baptism. It's a wonderful thing, both for the family, heterosexual couples and gay couples who have gone through the IVF treatment, and their joy has been fulfilled. They've had the baby, and the families come, and it's a wonderful testimony to this psalm that you quoted. The other part of me happens to believe that not all the cells divide naturally, and the mistakes happened when the cells divide. And I've been in hospitals on children's wards where the deformities are all there to be seen. The abnormalities of young babies deformed, knit together in my mother's womb. Well, you know, they weren't knit together really. And that's the sadness that the parish priest comes across in dealing with the whole concept of embryology. For some people, God is wonderful. I've had this beautiful IVF baby. And other people come distraught and distressed. It hasn't worked for me. I don't believe in God anymore.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'll just separate the IVF from the problems in development, because there's not necessarily a connection between those two, but yeah, there will always be people who emerge from the womb not 100% intact, and the question of suffering, and particularly this is something that Alistair Coles will be speaking later on today, last talk today, is faced with every single day as a neurologist in hospital, and has thought about this very deeply. And yeah, that's the flip side for this discussion of wonder and awe, is what about the suffering? And what a long discussion it is. And I'm sure you have your way of dealing with that. I won't straight away blame it on the fall, because as someone who studied evolutionary biology, I think God's good earth, for some reason, included the ability for things to, in our eyes, go wrong and cause, pain and suffering. Why? I don't know. I have experienced enough and know enough about God to trust that He is good and He knows what He's doing. And that He gives us everything we need to go through those kind of trials. And I'm speaking for someone who has that in my family. We've all had to deal with this kind of thing. I'm not just have had a nice life and haven't had to face this question. And there are all we don't have time, the philosophical and theological ways of dealing with this intellectually. I don't find any of them satisfying on a pastoral level. So I'm left with then a theological answer. I think we have to go to theology for an answer to it. But I unashamedly present the positive stuff without mentioning the negative, because nobody else is doing it. Very few people are doing it in a Christian context. We so often do go straight to the painful things and the difficult questions without enjoying that God is our good Father and has given us wonderful things. That's not a complete answer. That's why I'm doing what I'm doing. So, but thank you for raising that.